In 1972, my local bowling alley had this new arcade game, different from pinball machines that I never saw before. And it was called Pong. And I played it, and unfortunately it changed my life forever. So I don't know if I'm happy to introduce this guy, but here's the guy who invented Pong, the third employee of the best video game company that ever existed, Atari, Mr. Alcorn.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. When they asked me to see if I give a talk or something, I have this talk that I took some time to put together, and I have used it on other occasions, but I thought it'd be perfect for you guys, something a little different here. I was asked by the University of Indiana, back in Indianapolis, to give a talk to they were teaching a course on the history of video games. And I was asked to give a talk on the relationship, why did Atari happen when it did? You know, what was the culture, what were the circumstances, the cultural circumstances surrounding the formation of Atari? So I have a little talk on that, and I'd be happy to, I'll share, I put some photographs and some early stuff, and then I can entertain questions later on if you have any. So, but anyhow, I hope this works. We'll see if we can get some insight, because I think it was a very interesting time. There we go. So I subtitled this, Avoid Missing Ball for High Score. That was kind of the motto of Atari. So when I was younger, I'm in the back. Oh, hang on just a second here. I'm actually in the back. When I was me in high school, we had a chem lab. This wasn't the school's chem lab. This was our chem lab, and we had lots of really good stuff. And did get in a lot of trouble today for doing that stuff. Indeed, one guy lost an eye, but we had fun. We got hauled into jail once in a while, but we never got booked or anything. But that's me back there, and those are all chemicals. And, we had a count at Van Waters and Rogers, so we were pretty precocious. I was pretty precocious doing things you shouldn't do. Just out of high school, a friend of mine bought an Aston Martin, old junker, and we fixed it up and hot rodded around, so I was doing some of that. This is up in San Francisco. So after that, I wound up going to Berkeley in the 60s. So I was actually I was a football player, and at the time, and I was like all state, all city, and I didn't get a scholarship, but I got into Berkeley by the basis of being on the football teams. Otherwise, I'd have to go to Santa Cruz campus or something like that. And I really, really wanted to get a degree in engineering because I was fixing TVs when I was in junior high school. My neighbor had a TV repair shop, so I worked there. So because of that, I got a very good understanding of how TVs work, not from a theory, but from a practical, very practical standpoint. And then when I went to college in Berkeley during the 60s, it was actually a very interesting and turbulent time, which has something to do with all this. I turned that knowledge how to fix TVs into paying my way through college. I wanted to get a job at a TV repair shop. So I had that knowledge, and I was also able to pay my way through school. And then the 60s came about, and I was in the middle of all that. And so some of you people who are too young, most of you were too young to remember that time. But the Vietnam War was going on. Our parents, and this I'm talking about not myself just, but everybody in that generation, because Atari was of that generation. Your parents had survived the Great Depression and World War II, and then you strife, and the idea of getting a job, what you were supposed to do at that time was get a job. If you got a job at a good company like Ampex, you stayed there, you had a career, you had a pension, you got a gold watch, you had retirement, and that was the way, it was a very good deal. You lived a very good life. The idea of quitting a company or getting fired was very devastating, and taking a risk with your college education by like boycotting all the classes was not a great idea, at least with the parents. So there was this split, and meanwhile the Vietnam War was going on, and people were dying. We all had friends that were dying, and we didn't want to really go, and we wanted to protest the war because we didn't think it was a just war in the first place. So all that was going on. There was this big split between the culture. It was called the generation gap. They don't use that term anymore, but that's what was happening. So that's all going on at this time. In fact, here's a book, a photo book of People's Park, And at the time, I was working in a TV repair shop when the People's Park riots came about, right on Telegraph Avenue in the middle of the whole thing. So we were in no man's land. The blue Unity cops were on one half a block down, and the protesters were a block that way, and tear gas was in the middle. I was sitting there, I was get high in the building. My advice if you're a tear gas, get high, don't get low, because it stays low. This is a picture I took. It was in the book of what it was like at People's Park before the invasion, and then afterwards, this is a picture I took that was somebody, the National Guard came in. So it was a very, very tense time, and there was a lot of stress. My father was a merchant seaman, and he was shipping napalm to Vietnam. My brother was a police officer in Concord, and I was a student on the campus. So it was very interesting at family dinners. We got along well, but it was an interesting time, I must say. So I wound up at when I was in college, I happened to go to work at Ampex because basically Cal was pretty tough and it was hard work on my way through, and I had this idea. They had this program hardly anybody was in called Work Study, which I think is a great deal. So in an engineering program, you could go to school for six months, 2 quarters, and then go to work at a real company and get an education, and actually not an education, but some practical experience of what it was like, and then go back to school. And theoretically, you'd make enough money during the work, you could pay for your way through school. Well, I wound up at Ampex, but the reality is I spent the money as fast as I made it. But what I did get out of it was a really keen understanding with a great bunch of guys. There were people there I met at Ampex, like Nolan Bushnell, Steve Mayer, Larry Emmons. These are people that were all instrumental in Atari later on. So they came on, all these young people that were at Ampex. And at Ampex, I worked in a group with some of the people that at the time, this was 1968 when I started, home videotape recorders weren't available, but these are some of the people that invented videotape recording, the whole process, some of the best video engineers. So here I was, a younger kid, fixing TVs and getting shocked and not really understanding how it worked, to going through school to understand the theory, and then actually working with people who really knew what video was. The other thing was, because I was a young guy at school at Cal, I wound up learning digital electronics. Because Berkeley, they get a broad experience, so I had wound up with a degree in electrical engineering and computer science, so I learned digital chips, even though I wanted to do video and analog, which video was analog at the time. But because I had the knowledge of digital stuff, my work experience, they'd keep tapping me to do the digital stuff because I knew it really well. I just been through school on it. So indeed, and that's kind of the hybrid. So I learned how to make sync generators and really cute little things with TTL and the team. So at the time, so I left, I came back. The second time I came back to Ampex, Nolan was gone. Nolan had done the craziest thing. He wasn't, frankly, I love him, but he's not the best engineer. And in retrospect, they weren't sure why they hired him, but boy, was he an entrepreneur. He was out there, he had a stock league formed, so they get 4 or 5 guys together, get enough money, they can buy some stock. And he was very entrepreneurial, and he had worked at the amusement park, and I'm sure you've all heard the story, so he understood the power and the money ability of a coin-operated game, and he thought he could make one with the computers and video stuff. And so he had gone off to this company called Dunning Associates and designed this game, moonlighting at Ampex, called Computer Space. Well, and he quit his job at Ampex to go full-time. And I subsequently recently talked to the guy who was the president of Ampex at the time, and Nolan was at the bottom of the rung in engineering, and when he quit, he called him in. He said, Mr. Bushnell, do you realize you're throwing away a career? You know, people did not start companies at that point in time. And don't you think it's unwise, and you really think twice before you make this move? No, I'm going to go. So by the time I got back, Nolan was gone. And then about 5 months into this thing, Ampex was having some financial trouble, and Nolan came by in the company car to pick me up and go have lunch. And I go, what's a company car? And I discovered it's a car you have to pay for. You just get to drive. And wow, this is great. You know, and it was a Buick station wagon, but nevertheless, it was free. So I was very impressed, and Nolan, and so then Syzygy got started. That was Syzygy was the name of the company, and the rest you probably guys know all too well, the $500 in capital. It's gone, I've seen it raised to $5,000. It wasn't much, and we had a bunch of pinball machines. We had a contract from Bally that Nolan never talks about. We're going to give them a video game, a pinball machine, and I forget what else. And then so we started CGE, and we started this thing called Pong. There's where we started. That's actually the building today that Atari was started in. And it's a company that makes abrasives, a distributor for abrasive products and tools. And I went in there and I introduced myself, and they had no idea that's where Atari started. I mean, it's just another started place in Silicon Valley. It could be anything. So yeah, Nolan told me, you want to hear this story? Have you heard it all too many times? We got this contract from GE. Nolan bullshits me. He says, okay, I got this contract from General Electric to make a home game. And geez, the home game was going to cost like 10, 15 bucks to make. And he described this thing with one moving objects and two paddles and a net and a simple score. And later on, I found he got the idea from the Magnavox Odyssey game, the home game. But he knew that at the time, that game was not a very good game. The way it was designed, it wasn't going to play that well. So he figured if he gave it to me as an exercise, because it was so simple, he could throw it away and then get me to do the real game later on. But he lied to me and didn't want me to think it was an exercise. He wanted me to really work at it. But it was kind of like the movie The Producers, because when we put it out, after I finished making it work good, it like, wow, it really played well. And now we had this kind of a funny problem, because Nolan had stolen the game. That, and it was like the producers, like, oh shit, it wasn't a bad game. Well, in retrospect, they sent us a letter and they sued us and we settled it and it was okay, it was the right thing to do. Moral of the story is if you're gonna try to build something, don't worry about somebody might have a patent or something. You do it, you make money in it, they'll send you a letter, they'll let you know. Yeah. So yeah, that was, so Nolan, so yeah, I tried to make it playable, tried to make it better game, because the simple way he described it, you couldn't play, so I had to speed up, and the dead zone at the top, if you ever played the real Pong, and that was actually an artifact of the circuitry. It was a defect in the circuitry I was going to get around to fixing, but we realized it was important, because if that wasn't there, good players could make a play forever. They'd never win. So if you were really good, you could aim for that dead spot at the top, and we left it in. So hence my moral, if you can't fix it, call it a feature. But I was bummed out because it was a flop, it was a flop from the standpoint, it was way too expensive, 75 chips, to put into a home game. That was not going to work. So, but Nolan said, let's put it in location. We had this pinball route at the time, which was really great. And by the way, when I was actually doing the headwork to design the Pong circuits, I go back, in the back we had a little garage, like a 3 or 4 car garage back there, back of that building, and we had old pinball machines and stuff for our route. So I fell in love with the Bally Fireball, the original Bally Fireball, best pinball machine. So I play that and get inspiration, subconscious inspiration, how to solve some of these problems. So we put it in location to see if they liked it. That's the first location, Andy Cap's Tavern, it's now called Rooster Teeth Feathers, and they don't like people talking about it because they just want you to buy beer. They don't want to talk about video games. So that's actually the first Pong machine. The board down here is the wire wrap board that I did. This was just a couple. The last time this convention was on, it was in the Bay Area, and I had that machine there. Some of you may have seen it. We still have that machine. But there's the coin box, which was from a kind of a laundromat add-on, and that's the famous coin box that we put out there. Within a couple of weeks, the game stopped, and I went out to fix it, opened the coin box up, and all these quarters gushed out. So I figured, I filled my pockets full of quarters and gave the guy one of my CGE business cards and said, hey, the next time that happens, give me a call at home. I'll come and fix that. So I said to Nolan the next day, man, that was the weirdest thing I ever saw. And Nolan said, And all of a sudden the wheels are turning, and we weren't going to build any. Oh, I don't know if you want to. Yeah. All right. The reason I put this in here was because I did some of this talk at one time to a group of Stanford undergraduates in computer science, and they asked me, they said, well, what was the program like on the first Pong? And I said, well, there wasn't any program. Well, I mean, just the machine code, you know, listing, you know, object A. I said, what microprocessor would I have used in 1972? He said, well, it was a 4004 had just come out, but that thing was so slow you could watch it work, you know. And they said, well, how can you build anything without a microprocessor? So basically, in a nutshell, how you do it is pretty simple. You start with the basic video is a horizontal line. There's your horizontal sync pulse, and there's a color subcarrier burst of the 3.58 megahertz signal, and then there's the black and white transitions that define the picture, the black and white spots, and then there's the end of the scan line, and that line is 63 microseconds. And then, as Dave and the guys previously were talking, you then count the lines in hardware. They did it in software in the VCS, and you count, you know, 265 lines, and you had vertical. So that was how you was counting lines. And the block diagram here, you just simply divide an oscillator by so much, and then you have a decoding logic down here to map out where the horizontal sync pulse is, any vertical bars where the net would come out of that, and then you counted lines in this counter here, and that was vertical signal, and then you map out all the pictures there. And there's a little bit of game control logic, and then one of the harder things here was making the ball move, motion circuit. Anyway, it's pretty technical, but that's simply, and then the ball comes out of here. You just map out. It's basically you have two counters. Usually I see it in the vertical, so I have divide by 262 here. That defines my vertical scale line, the top to bottom. Down here I have a counter that can divide anywhere from 261 to 264. So if it's at 262, the thing will just sit there and be stationary, the crossing of those two counters. And if it's 261, it'll start to move up the screen. And if it's 263, it'll start to move down. So that's simple. And that's how, with no memory, there's no memory circuits, there's no frame buffer, none of that stuff. There was no memory, there was no microprocessor, it's just counters. So that's how you do it. So anyway, we started Atari to be a design engineering company. The original goal was never to be a manufacturer. We were going to do brilliant ideas and give them to Valley to build, and Valley would send us checks, and we'd be rich. Well, Nolan, all of a sudden, when Pong started taking off like a bat out of hell, Nolan was faced with the problem. He had to convince Valley they didn't really want this game. They wanted the next game. And he had to convince us, me and Ted Dabney, to build Pong and to sell it, go into manufacturing, which is something we don't want to do that. We were engineers. We wanted to do, engineering stuff, not manufacturing, but the money was going to be in manufacturing. Nolan knew that. So he managed to. He went back to Valley owned Midway. He told Valley that Midway agreed they didn't want it, and told Midway that Valley wouldn't take it, and somehow got them to go on it. Eventually, subsequently, Valley just copied the game. Everybody else did. So we go to production with Pong, and that's, many of you have seen that board and have them. That's one of the first production Pong boards. Single board. If you look at Computer Space, it had 3 boards and connectors. They didn't like that. This is much more reliable. And the other thing was the television set that was inside there. Back in those days, you would go to Magnavox or Motorola, and you could buy for $500 a beautiful green television set that looked in the airports. It was just terrible. And I went to, because my experience fixing TVs, I went to Walmart and bought a $75 black and white Hitachi set, which still works, by the way, 35 years later. And clipped a few wires, and within an hour made a monitor out of it. And so that's how we went into production. We had to buy hundreds of monitors of TV sets from Hitachi, remember that? And then modify them on the line. We had a big mountain of UHF antennas and earplugs that we couldn't use. Black plastic, but it was much cheaper. And we used a bread pan for a coin box, which was pretty crude. We were always weak on the coin map for quite a long time. So there's the brochure. Video skill game. Somebody was asking me when the first use of the word video game came about. Right? Obviously it wasn't here. It was called a video skill game. Interesting. And remember, at that point, it said Atari Corporation, CGE Engineered, because Nolan had some fantasy about taxes and stuff, and so the engineering was to have CGE company. Now, we were going to incorporate the CGE, but we couldn't do it because somebody else had the name. So we had our second choice of the name was Atari. So we still used the letterhead internally for quite a while because we were so cheap. Lots of paper printed up. That was the original team. That's Ted Dabney. There's yours truly. You can guess who that is. At that time, he even had the mole on his cheek. That was Fred Marinchak. Anybody know Fred Marinchak here? Good. Yeah, he was first chief financial officer, and he was taking kickbacks on some of those monitors. He wasn't there much longer than that picture. The weird thing about Pong was it was a two-player only game, and I don't think you can show me any other video game that's only two players, doesn't have a one-player mode. That was a mistake, but it worked. And there were lots of copies. There were lots of copies of that game. It was pretty simple to build, but we didn't know how to. We weren't building things, so it was just amazing that we got anything. We got first production out of a little building you saw back there. Our second place, once it took off, was a roller skating rink, a few blocks away on Martin. And it was funny. We were so amateur. As long as you're on a company only building one thing, you don't need any documentation. Everybody knows how to build that thing. But the minute the next game came in the pipeline, all hell breaks loose, because now does this part go in this game or that game, so we had to get documentation. We learned everything by trial and error. There were lots and lots of people copying our games in the early days, lots of people. They were fairly easy to copy, and so we tried over time to do things that we could use to stop the copiers, and there's stories about that. So this is by like 1973, 74, a year and a half old. And we're doing quite well. Our goal was to be as big as Bally. Bally Corporation was really a company that Nolan admired. They were the biggest. Bally Midway was the biggest in the industry. So by this time, we were about as big as Bally. And what next? And Nolan had this weird idea. Is it here? Or was it? Yeah, oh boy, I don't know if you can read this or not. This is how Pong actually came about. You'll see the CGE letterhead, you'll notice. Now the date on this thing is August 3rd, 1973. So this is already a year old. We long since dropped the name of CGE, we were Atari, but because we had so much of this letterhead printed up, we kept using it internally. And Nolan and I had this running battle. Nolan wanted all this stuff, and we had no manufacturing capacity and not a lot of money or anything. So I'll read it to you if you don't mind, because let me set some more stage here. So Nolan was driving. This is the style of Nolan. He wanted everything, pushing. We had like 3 or 4 guys in engineering. This is again, we're less than a year old, just about a year old. So he says, in accordance with a concise business plan, which we didn't have, the following is the charter for engineering. This is 2 engineering from Nolan Bushnell. 1, have a minimum of 4 acceptable production-ready machines by December 31st, 1973. This is less than 6 months. Away in excess of the production needs. 2, have a design and manufacturing set up for Chicago-type coin door as soon as possible. Have sufficient staff that at least 1 engineer can be assigned to, quote, emergency projects, unquote, without upsetting major schedules. See, Nolan has a very short attention span. So he would get bored with the project, and he'd run into engineering and change the project, not even telling me. If you did this, nothing would ever get released. You had to have some consistency. So I banned Nolan from engineering. He didn't like that, so that's why he wanted to have, we called it his F troop, you know. So he says, item 4, have a custom installed 20-player gotcha for this fall's the IAAP show. 20-player machine, okay. Packaging for Dr. Pong. Now I think we saw Puppy Pong. Somebody has one in the museum. There's a Puppy Pong there. And that was Nolan's idea, to market it to people that would have it in their doctor's office so kids could play that. They don't read National Geographics or something, you know. And it never did sell or anything, but this is where he was pushing. Item 6 on the list. Packaging and printed circuit board for color modulated home Pong, consumer Pong. Item 6 on the list. This is like a new industry, just item 6 on this list. Develop staff to provide game documentation and manuals. That was the weakness. We had to get documentation. And parts order catalogs for a more finished type machine. Yeah, fair enough. And design a booth for the November MOA show. We did design the booth, and it almost set the place on fire. The fire marshal made us pull it off. We couldn't even bribe him in Chicago. That's how bad it was. Then he says, every effort should be made to develop adequate staffing to handle this workload. The last sentence is great. Statements concerning our manufacturing capacity are inapplicable to the above design schedule. Signed, Nolan Bushnell. So I don't have, I managed to save this one. The memo I sent back was to Nolan Bushnell from engineering. Is the fact that we have no money a reason not to do some of these things? And Nolan took that memo and wrote on it, big marker, no. So, okay, so I figured the toughest one on the list and the most fun one was going to be the consumer Pong. I mean, that would be a lot more fun to do, and I could, so we went off and did it. And I gave engineering over at Coin-Op Engineering to Steve Bristow, who had to deal with the rest of this list. But that was the style, and this is, I think, a lot of how, this is about the time Steve Jobs came to work for us. And Steve was in engineering when this was going on, and would see the interaction between me and Nolan. And Nolan would push, he would not take no for an answer, and he drove. He didn't get everything he wanted, but he led the industry. I mean, he created a whole industry doing this. Whereas the traditional way of management wasn't going to create video games, So yeah, as I said, I gave point up to Bristow. Oh no, then there's a scene. So we finally, I put a team of 3 guys together to do home Pong. And there's a prototype chip in the museum. You can see there's a prototype wafer and the very first printed circuit board that we had. And I remember when we got the first chip back, there's one of them in there in the museum. And we plugged it into a board, and I'm getting video. It worked. It felt like a dog chasing a car. Like, what do you do when you catch it? I mean, now that we had this chip, we had no entree into consumer manufacturing, consumer products. We didn't know anybody. Nobody built consumer products in Silicon Valley. I mean, it was all semiconductors and military stuff and Ampex and industrial. And Nolan just, we started calling Sears Tower in Chicago, cold call, and finally got the right buyer, and we just got lucky. And he came out, and Tom Quinn saw the product. And he was fascinated. He was selling the Magnavox Odyssey game in the catalog only. And he knew how well it could be done, but he couldn't get Magnavox to get many more games. They did not want it to, they wanted people to think it would only work on a Magnavox television set. They didn't want to make money. They wanted to sell big television sets. They didn't realize there were already dinosaurs and dying on that. And thank God that Ralph had that, they had that patent. I just wish Ralph had gotten some money from that patent, the Magnavox made a ton. But we didn't want to sell everything we could make the first year to Sears. So we told Tom Quinn that we were going to go to the toy fair in New York, and we're going to sell it to other players too. So we did. Joe, Nolan, myself, I think Bill White, we went to the toy fair in Manhattan, and if you've ever been in the toy business, forget it. Every buyer, because we had no entrees, and this is in February, and they buy all their stuff for Christmas. And all the buyers from all the big department stores came by and saw it and said, that's cute. We did not sell one product, not one. Here was a product sitting there that was going to be the hit for the next 3 or 4 years, and we couldn't get any of these guys to do it. And so we were sold with Sears, which was great. Sears they made a ton of money off of it. But moral of the story there, just because somebody doesn't like it and something like that doesn't mean it's dead. You got to keep pushing it. Oh yeah, there's the consumer Pong prototype. This one my wife wire wrapped, so it's a lot nicer. But that's actually the chip. That's the chip emulator, and then it got put in a box that we went back to Chicago, to the headquarters of Sears and Roebuck, and after all the work was done, it was a big pitch. We had to show it to the vice president, exec staff, had to show this thing. They were holding the Christmas catalog for this thing. And this was completely out. I mean, this was such a wacky thing to them to do. And this is the very unit, I don't know if I'll tell the story, stop me if you've heard it, but this is the one where I tried to make it work and it didn't work. I couldn't get it to work, and I realized it's broadcasting. I had it going off on Channel 3. And they broadcast from Channel 3 on the top of the Sears Tower. So Gene Lipkin has to do a bullshit dog and pony show, which he could do forever, ad nauseum. And I had to open the bottom up and expose all this stuff, you know, and retune the oscillator. The oscillator is up in here. Retune it to channel. I got a TV set, got it going on channel 4. Put the back on. I do the presentation, play the game, and Carl Lynn, the vice president at division, the white goods, looks at me. He's from the South. He says, "Mr. Alcorn, you're telling me that you're going to put that rat's nest of wires in there, those red wires, all that stuff on a little tiny piece of silicone the size of your little fingernail?" I go, "Yes, sir." "How are you going to solder the wires to it?" Man, I'm in the wrong business. Yikes. I did not know what to say. So anyway, we got away with it. So that was the production version. Remember, it said Telegames. It said Atari on the switch here. That was negotiated, but Pong Telegames, because they had our production for the first year. God bless them, they were wonderful. Oh yeah, so then we started getting to cartridge games. It became obvious that video games, dedicated games, weren't going to make it. So we had cartridge, the idea of putting a game on a cartridge, and you had just heard the Activision guys talk about some of the cleverness of that chip, and I just love to hear that, because that was a really interesting time to design that circuit at that time. You know, with that much luck and insight, to make it cheap and make it have the flexibility that those guys talked about. It was far more flexible than we had ever envisioned. All the other people making video games, if you realize the Intellivision game was designed by a semiconductor company, all the other, Bally had a game that was designed by AMI, the chip companies would design the games, and of course, guess what? They'd use lots of silicon. They put frame buffers in, and they would design them looking at the last game that was out, and so they'd make fixed stamp size generators and stuff like that, but they memorialized their ideas of what a game was, and they were much less flexible, and the hardware cost 4 or 5 times what our hardware cost. You open our box up in the VCS, there's 3 chips in the whole thing, whereas you open up the others, there's lots of chips. And so we really had them on that, but it was also more flexible, which was really ironic and very interesting. So, but at the time, one of the guys competing with us was National Semiconductor, and Dick Bader, Tricky Dick Bader, went to Charlie Spork and said, "Oh, we can build this thing cheaper than those idiots over at Atari. They're just a bunch of video game guys. We're semiconductor guys." So he goes to the chief of his consumer device engineering that did calculators, really bright guy, John Ellis, and says, "Here, knock this off." And he opens it up, and there's nothing inside of it. He's, "Oh man, I can't." So the next thing you know, he calls us up, and we hire him and his entire design team. These guys are really good at design for manufacturability and design for production environment, much better than I could ever do. So they took over consumer engineering, which was my style. I'll build the first one. I'll make the first little toe in the water, and then get some guys that much better than I am to go in there and make a product out of it. That's not my forte. The other thing that was really tough was the FCC. The FCC rules were extremely strict at the time, inadvertently, and it was very hard to get over that. So, but we did. We found a way to do it. And then Warner came along. Then we had to go. The consumer business was growing so rapidly, we had to get money. We actually tried to go public. We actually created a red herring. I can't find that prospectus. That'd be very interesting. But this was in '76, and the market went sour, and we wound up, long story, bought by Warner Communication in November of '76. We sold to Warner. Oh, there's the Stella Prototype. There's the VCS. Too bad it didn't make it here. Hopefully, one of these days it'll get there. But it's not a great shot of it, unfortunately. What you really see here is the joysticks we drafted off of a tank game. Behind it is a wire wrap board, and there is a Jolt Kim board, a 6502 emulator, and a 5-volt power supply there. And so that is the prototype. That prototype was in the dumpster at Atari, and an engineer pulled it out and said, "Al, you should keep this." So I kept it. Oh yeah, well that's Nolan, and that's Lori. This was in, I think, Fortune magazine. The title of this was, well, Bushnell Sans Robot. This was back when he was doing the Androbot thing.
So which product was she named for?
What's that?
Which product was she?
Oh, well, you know, We actually had when we sold to Warner, we had an exec staff board meeting in the hot tub. And we had the attorney would not get in, Lon Allen would not get in, he wasn't that kind of guy. So but Nolan had bringing papers up all the time, and it was a lot of fun. We got real drunk. It was
Atari 800?
Beg your pardon?
Did you say her name was Lorraine?
No.
Lord.
So anyway, yeah, no, I would say that Atari was clearly a product of the 60s. You know, Atari, we took risk. The thing I wanted to point out was our motto was, I mean, we knew the worst we could do was tank Atari. We could kill the whole company. And if that happened, we'd go back to Ampex or someplace and get a job. And we'd be okay. And we felt that anything that grew so fast that we just took these risks. And what the hell if it didn't? We had fun doing it. So when we did the consumer stuff, we risked the whole company. We said, why not? I remember the attorney, when we had Don Allen started showing the board meetings, he was just frizzled. He couldn't stand it. We would just take these risks. But it was fun. We were not afraid of failure, because remember at that time the Cold War was going on. Anybody could die from a nuclear blast tomorrow anyhow, so what the hell? I mean, let's live and let's have fun doing it. So we played hard, we did work hard, our parties were legendary, but don't think we didn't work hard, because there was some great product that came out of Atari. But when we finished working, we worked equally hard and innovatively. We played innovatively too. And we did lots of mistakes. You've seen there's a video music out there in the museum, and all the engineers have one, and it's a great product. I think it's an indication. The reason Atari was creative and was able to be so creative under Nolan was we could make a complete flop, a complete failure like video music, and 6 months later introduce a product called the VCS. It was a great product, and not one person got fired or demoted or any trouble because of the video music. You know, it just didn't work. And Nolan would always say, don't give me any focus groups or market testing. I can bring a product to market cheaper and find out than I can by testing it. And that was his philosophy. And so we were not afraid to put new products out. And I'll submit at the end, the reason Atari failed was because under the Warner management, Ray Kassar and his team, they were so afraid of introducing a new product, and that product might fail and look bad on them. They never introduced a new product at all. And here they had $1 billion in revenue. I mean, they could afford to make 100 mistakes in a row and it wouldn't be bothered them at all. But in fact, they never released anything. There were lots of great things invented at Atari, but none of them got out the door. And you can see the remains of my Cosmos, my holographic project there in the museum. There was no reason not to build it except they wouldn't do it. So. But under Nolan's Atari was, again, a product of its time, a product of the pressure, a product of this young management team that didn't worry about what was right or politically correct. We just did it. We had a lot of fun doing it. So anyhow, that's my little talk. Thank you very much. Are there any questions I can answer?
What was the difficulties with the FCC? What was their?
All right.
Why were they interested in a home consumer?
Oh yeah, I'll tell you. Well, what happened, it was because of the Magnavox Odyssey game. And I'll give a lot of credit to Ralph there, because his product, the Magnavox Odyssey, hooked to the back of the TV set. Now again, you have to remember, in 1972, the only thing hooked to a TV set, twin lead antenna, was an antenna. There was no cable TV, there was no videotape recorder, and many of the chassis, because I used to fix these things, were hot chassis. So the chassis was connected to the one half of the power line coming in. So you didn't want to plug anything on the metal chassis, that's why the knobs were plastic. So then the antenna came into an RF transformer, so it was isolated. So so they realized that when you hook now, if you hook that the Magnavox Odyssey game was generating an RF signal that acted like channel 3. If you just put that on parallel with the antenna, that signal would get broadcast out and interfere with the neighbor and block the neighbor's thing, or unintended radiation from the electronics itself. Now the Magnavox Odyssey game was all analog, essentially. Even though there's digital function going on, there was no TTL chips in there, it was all analog. So it didn't make any of the high-frequency RF signals out of there. So the FCC used that product to institute, under Part 15 of the rules, a TV1 device rules, which they, again, didn't envision digital. So it allowed about as much radiation as came off the Magnavox Odyssey at 1 or 2 megahertz. And then on 100 megahertz, the limit was just really, really low because there wasn't anything there in that game. Well, Pong, you saw that schematic I had up there, the home Pong was like that, right? So you're basically taking a 3 megahertz signal and running it through a TTL device, transistor logic chip, 5 volts, and dividing it down. And those are making, cut a long story short, the spectrum analysis of that was flat out to 100 megahertz, all kinds of interference. And indeed, if you're unprotected, you would, if you did the prototype Pong itself that I had there, unshielded, you couldn't watch TV in a house when it was playing, right? So, but the rules were unnecessarily strict. So we found a way. I lost one engineer, I had to fire. One engineer was convinced it couldn't be done. I fired him, I figured I want him around. And I did it myself. I had to do it in my backyard of my home because there was too much signal coming off the production line at Atari. I was really in a foul mood because it was like, I had to get this done. The company was riding on this, and Nolan was like getting afraid to even be near me. I remember one time I barged into Nolan's office. I don't know who was there. I just barged in, I looked at Nolan, and I said, "If you think too hard, you're violating FCC rule part 2." I walked out, okay, okay. And it was a long story. We wound up, and this is back in the days because there was no devices like this at all on the market. You had to submit it to the FCC lab in Maryland, the headquarters in Maryland. So we stopped by the Sears headquarters and we double checked it in their testing labs. And the first time it didn't pass, we went back home, worked on another few weeks, found some really bad transistors to make it clean to get through the FCC rules. And we get there and a young engineer comes out to pick it up and he says, "Where's my case of Coors beer?" Because back in there, only Coors was on the West Coast. And so I told the attorney, we'd get him 2 cases, no problema, you know. So I finally got the letter, the approval. I stole the letter from Atari. I have it framed in my office to this day. And I didn't used to have gray hair, but I did after that. So, and once we figured out how to meet the rules, those rules are great. I mean, they're protecting the consumer against all kinds of harmful radiation. We're a big fan of those rules now, and nobody else could get there, you know. In fact, the Apple II computer was just like that. If you used the early Apple II computer, you couldn't watch TV next door. I mean, it was really bad, literally. And they were all trying to get the rules relaxed, saying it can't be done. We did it, we got it, you know, and TI, they got the rules changed anyhow, so that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, on Steve Wozniak's logic design for Breakout, how come they didn't go with that as the final one? I know last time you were saying it was too complicated and to reproduce or something? Yeah, well, okay, the story there was Steve Jobs had come back from meeting his guru in India, wanted his job back, okay, fine. And Steve Jobs' secret is that he had his buddy Woz come in at night and do all his work for him. And Woz was great. Woz could. So I didn't know this. I kind of thought Steve was doing some of the jobs. So and remember Nolan? Remember that thing I had there where Nolan said I want to have engineers decide to do special projects, you know, and this war was going on. So Jobs wasn't an engineer by any stretch of the imagination. So I wasn't watching him. So Nolan pulls Jobs off, unbeknownst to me, takes him into his office and describes this game of Breakout. And he says, "Steve, every chip less than 50, I'll give you a $1,000 bonus." So he gives Woz to do it. I know none of this. One day I come into work and late as usual, and the engineer, "Hey Al, you got to see this. There's this game Breakout playing in there." I came out of nowhere. It was on the schedule. We never talked about it. Nothing. What the hell's going on? And it was brilliant. It was like 15 ICs. Well, and Woz gamed it. The rules were ICs. Didn't say you had to be able to buy the ICs. Some of the ICs were there from internal Hewlett-Packard parts you couldn't buy. And so like the score was a Hewlett-Packard, an LED digit, you gave a BCD number and it came up with lights, you know, one chip, which would replace 5 TTL chips, maybe, you know. So he did it, and Nolan paid the bonus, even though it kind of cheated. But Nolan, that's the way you play games. You know, those are the rules. Nolan could have said production chips, not, you know, fantasy chips. But the problem is that Woz is, I mean, he's a savant. He's gifted. He had the whole thing in his head. So there's some minimum logic. Now, the way you build a printed circuit board, the way you build a point-out video game is you typically you build a circuit board, you put the parts in them, you fire it up, it's not going to work. There's a solder bridge somewhere, and you have to put it on a in a test area where normal human beings, not Wozniaks, but normal human beings, would test it. And I couldn't understand how the thing worked, you know, and the tech doesn't understand how it worked. So it was unproducible. I mean, I couldn't get the parts anyhow. So, but about 8
The parts weren't
months.
available, huh? Oh.
No, not these Hewlett. Some of them were, but the Hewlett Packard, that was expensive. Some of them were RAM memory. We're going to put that in there. That was way too expensive.
Okay.
So what happened, about 8 months later, I gave the basic to a normal engineer, and they designed it with 100 ICs, and it was a big hit. But it was the same game. But it was that was the story. It just wasn't producible. That was the same. People don't realize, I mean, half the things in engineering, just having design isn't it. You got to make something producible. And Atari almost died when my replacement VP of engineering, Lloyd Warman, let Larry Emmons at Grass Valley to productize the driving game Grand Track. It could not be built. So when I came back in, they fired Lloyd and got me in. All I did was relay the board out with a wiring harness and normal stuff, and we could build it.
So on Breakout, literally the signals that came out of Woz's stuff were completely emulated with more chips. Same net result signals that came out.
Well, I don't think the signals were the same, but the picture on the screen was the same.
Got it.
The gameplay was the same, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
No more? Yeah.
What were the circumstances under which you left Atari finally?
Oh, well, I was, of the original guys, I was the last guy to leave. There was a lot of, in spite of what was going on, there was a lot of love for the company. It was like my baby, you know, and I had a lot of attachment to it and the people, many of the people there. And it was getting pretty rough. And I had done this, I figured under Ray Kassar, I wasn't in that clique. So I either had to quit, like Joe and Nolan did, or go off and stick around. So I made a conscious decision to go back into engineering and do what I was good at doing, and put a team together with Roger Hector and Harry Jenkins, and we set about using the technology holography, which is not the way, you don't design a product by saying, hey, let's do something with holography that can make something. And then, by the way, let's make a good game out of it, you know, but we did stupid stuff like that and kind of got away with it. And we solved the production. We created the first embossed holograms, and there's a beautiful example of that in the museum here. And they wouldn't build it. I mean, at the end, I mean, I played so many political games. The organization, as I said before, was afraid to ship anything because it might not do as well as the VCS, so they just wouldn't do anything. So I couldn't believe it was that bad. So I got this thing pretty much working, and oh, we can't ship this. We had a business plan. I said I never did a business plan before. I mean, didn't seem to need it. It worked okay. Okay, so I got a friendly guy in marketing to help me. We did a business plan, and we lost money the first year, but made money the second year. Well, we can't do that. It loses money the first year. What? So I did another business plan, product X, and gave it to him. It lost money the first 2 years. That's even crazy. He says, okay, we'll shut the VCS line down because those are the numbers from the first Atari VCS. We lost money the first 2 years, okay? Oh, blah, 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 blah. So, okay, I got past that. And then the manufacturing guy, Paul Malloy, says, we're too busy building Atari VCSs to build any of your stuff. I said, would you please put that in writing? And he does, and so I says, great, I found a vendor outside in Texas that can build them cheaper and better anyhow, and now you can't touch it because you said in writing you're too busy. Oh, and I can do it now. I mean, I got past all these hurdles, and at the end, Ray Kassar, we had this meeting, I won't name our informal name for it, but it was at Bristow and all the old timers. We'd have a meeting once a week. He'd placate us and listen to us to do his own stuff. And we said to Ray, he says, you're not going to ever ship to Cosmos, are you? He said, no. So, fine, forget it. You know, there was no good reason. He lost all the reasons. He just was scared to ship it, was the problem. So that's why I left. I mean, I was better off just having fun playing around on my own. And they were happy to see me go, I can tell you. I mean, I was the guy running around saying the king had no clothes. They did not like that. So they paid me good money not to show up, and I had a company car not to show up in, and it was a fine. If I'm your man, if you want me not to show up, I'm good. Years of experience. Yeah.
What do you think of the Atari name now and what it's become under Infograms?
I think that I've met some of the guys. I think they're trying to make a comeback, and they're trying to, I think, do justice. At least the German people are to the name. I think it's a step up from what Trammell and that, So I'm glad to see the name along, and the logo around. I mean, the name and the logo are funny. I mean, how we picked it. And then when Warner bought us, they said, oh, you gotta spruce up your image, your logo and everything. So they hire a firm. This is, you realize this, the Atari logo was done by George Opperman at Atari. You know, he was a consultant, and we paid him like, you know, a few $1,000 for it. It was done, and we hired him. And he was the Atari look for all the early days. And when Warner tested it, at least they did it right. They had to test it, and they went, oh my God, it had better recognition visually with kids than Mickey Mouse and Coca-Cola. You know, like, don't touch it. You know, it was, holy moly. So, you know. Yeah.
I saw Blade Runner recently again. I just noticed that the logo is a Blade Runner as well. So.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah.
So the guys who wrote that movie.
You know, in 1982, if the Academy Awards, Johnny Carson was the moderator. And in one of his gags, he was talking about Warner, and he kept saying Atari. Because we accounted for 2/3 of the revenues of Warner Communications at the time. I mean, it was like staggering. And it was funny because this is 1982, I'm going around saying Atari is dead. It's brain dead. There's nothing up there. It's just walking around like a chicken with the head cut off. It's moving, but don't worry. And they're going, you're crazy. Look at this. We're making billions of dollars in revenue. And you know, unfortunately, I was right. It was sad. It was crazy. Yeah.
So what do you think about the resurgence in the retro stuff, like with the Flashback 2? Have you had a chance to play with that? Were you consulted on that at all?
No, I'm off. I start companies, so I'm off doing weird stuff. I love coming here and meeting people like the old stuff. But I think it's nice, you know, people, I think there's certain, I'm a little kind of sad that the video games today have evolved to something like making movies. The amount of overhead and expense now is way too serious. I mean, you talk to even the guys at Activision or whatever, all the flops you might have, we could afford to do a lot of flops. These guys can't do it, so other than we seems to have taken the idea up and tried to do something different, God bless them. But I mean, everybody's so scared. It's like they're making movies of old bad television shows from the 50s because they can't, you know, they're afraid to do something new. And so I would see some of that, I think, in the big, because it's $30 million or so to build a video game. This is crazy. I mean, I couldn't do that. Give me fertile territory where I'm the only guy around. I could be the smartest guy. I mean, I told this one kid I was playing. For a while, I was the best Pong program player in the world because I was the only one. You know, the best for a week or two.
What are you doing now?
I'm in a company called IMMI, Integrated Media Measurement. You can look up on the web, immi.com. We measure media consumption, like Nielsen ratings. We measure what you listen to, radio, TV, movies, whatever, using a cell phone. Much more efficient way of doing it. So we have a contract with Nielsen. Look us up on the internet. It's, you know, before that, I did a toy Zowie, a playset, kids playset for interval research. Before that, I had a slot machine for lovely Vegas called the Magnavox. So the Odyssey, we called it the Odyssey. No pun intended. God. But it was Silicon Gaming was the company. So we got licensed by the Game Control Board. And spent a lot more time here in Vegas than I really wanted to. It was a lot of fun. I mean, we had it was fun disrupting that industry with putting a hard disk and a PC. It was basically an Intel motherboard in a slot machine case, you know, with lots of crypto security around it, so it was appropriate for the environment. But basically, you're designing a human interface for people who are drunk and don't like computers. You know, it was really a challenge. I like that. So I like doing different things. I worked at video professional video stuff when I was Ampex. I involved in creating something called MPEG, you probably heard of, and working on the early team for that, and QuickTime at Apple. Wow. So I'm kind of moving target. You know, grew into a few companies. I'm going to tell you about the failures, a lot of failures. Yeah.
So, obviously, when Atari sold out to Warner, they didn't make any choice at that point. They were in bad situations, my understanding. What do you think Warner's major early mistakes were? Was it just too much management, or where did it all start?
Well, I think the question was, what were the mistakes? What were really the mistakes that Warner made? What did they do wrong? I think at the highest level, it was a misunderstanding of culture clash, that there was an East Coast kind of a managed top-down company, or Hollywood. They understood the movie studios and they understood strong-arming stars.
And when they took over, they tried to treat Silicon Valley people that way, and they did not understand that in the high-tech business, that technology, Morty Moore's law, is evolving fast enough that if you don't obsolete your own product, somebody else will. They didn't understand that. They were into an evergreen idea that you had a product that would run forever, like Burlington fabric or linen or typical products of Procter & Gamble. That wasn't the case here. They hired all these Procter & Gamble product marketing guys that didn't understand that. So that was, I think, a mistake on the product sense. I mean, the good news was they advertised it and stuck with it. Had they not done it, Nolan and Joe would have killed the VCS. The truth was, we would have shut it down in '81 and done something else. Maybe it would have been better. I don't know. Maybe it would have been worse. But it was a wise idea in retrospect. So that was a good thing they did and spent the money to advertise it and promote it. But the other thing they didn't do, and the Activision guys talked about it, and the Atari guys, was they did not understand the people and the culture. There was an elitism, and that's being kind. I mean, there was after Ray took in, he had an executive dining room for only the executives, so you wouldn't get soiled by what they called, I swear to God, the great unwashed. And I wouldn't go in there to save my life, you know, because I wanted to go to the engineering. I could find out what was going on in the engineering stuff, and they were in this bubble. Talk about a bubble. And they didn't know they didn't know E.T. was a bad game. It wouldn't work. They didn't know this, and everybody else seemed to. But you know, and they pissed them off. And just the way I think Dave described it, because I saw it from the other side, and what Dave didn't tell you, didn't even know. Maybe he did. The coin-op division, they were on a royalty basis. They got a bonus, depending on how well the coin-op game did. The team got a bonus, and they shared it among them. And Al Miller, Bob Whitehead, Dave Crane, Larry Kaplan did not. They were being paid $30,000 a year. I'll tell you another story about how bad it was. I mean, and Dave said they weren't going to give them the money. They wouldn't give them a raise, a bonus, a hearty handshake, nothing. You're just people. Well, one day I took over for Steve Bristow when he was on vacation running VP of Consumer Engineering for a while, for fun of it. And there was a meeting with marketing, the new marketing group, the Procter & Gamble types, and engineering about going to a 4K or an 8K ROM on the cartridge. And we had this meeting, and I kind of chaired it, and I said, okay, from the marketing guys, what is our standard cost of goods on the cartridge? Well, we can't tell you that. What do you mean? Oh, we're all on the same team. You can tell us. We'll keep a secret. Oh, no, that's classified information. I said, wait a second. This is engineering. Where do you think the standard cost of goods comes from? It comes from accounting. Right, they add up the cost of all the parts. Who picks the parts? Engineering. We can figure it out. He wouldn't tell us. I said, there's no way we can have a meeting. We didn't even trust us enough to tell us this meeting is over. It was literally. I mean, they wouldn't even tell engineering what the cost of goods sold on their own product was. Now, I've never seen that before or since, but the handwriting is on the wall. It's time to go home about that time. So they just didn't get the culture, and not until, the ET stopped selling did they realize it. Ray Kassar went out, remember that time he got in Fortune magazine, quoted all the engineers, a bunch of high-strung prima donnas? Coin-Op had a t-shirt printed up in a week that said, I'm just another high-strung prima donna from Atari. You've probably seen this t-shirt. Within 10 days, Ray Kassar had to wear that t-shirt. Oh, I was just kidding. But he learned. I mean, he came from a place where if you were the boss, they did what you told them, period. But that, in Silicon Valley, you only gain the respect that you earn. And if you don't earn it, you don't have it. I had one time, Steve Ross, or the top guys at Warner, Manny Gerard, came through one of my special research projects I had going, a secret project, and there was one guy, Fred. I said, hey Fred, why don't you take tomorrow off? Just go home. Because Fred did not, suffered fools, did, and I said, look, we're gonna explain the deal, just don't say anything, okay? Well, sure enough, he comes by and he asks Fred, what's that? He says, well, if you don't frickin' know, you're the chairman of the board, you should know. Thank you very much, Fred, for your insight. We went on, and by this time the president was used to this kind of craziness, but you just get any respect unless you earned it. And these guys didn't understand that. All right, thank you very much, guys.